So, Ashley, for those that may not be familiar, can you just talk a little bit about the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation in general and the work that you do?
Sure, for sure. So I'm a senior policy researcher at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, also known as MTF. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank in Boston. We're sort of most known for our analysis of the state budget and state finances, also do policy research in healthcare and transportation. And for the last year and a half or so, I have been really focused on policy issues related to early education and care.
So, Ashley, early childhood education also near and dear to my heart, primarily just because I have three young children under the age of 7, so pretty familiar with it here in Massachusetts. Can you talk to us about the role that Massachusetts occupies? Because from what I understand, there is nowhere more expensive to send a child to childcare other than maybe Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well, I think it's a mix of things, and I think it's really important to note that, across the U.S., the child care market is really mostly private, right? That
Yep.
funding from the federal government helps to subsidize just a fraction of the families who actually need care. And so how that plays out in Massachusetts is we serve about 53,000 children through the subsidy system, but there are over 300,000 children under 6 with both parents in the workforce, right? To give you a sense of what I mean by fraction, right? So I think the fact that the majority of the system is completely private contributes to the cost. I think Massachusetts also really benefits compared to other states from a pretty high quality system. And I think that's partially due to our teacher to child ratios, right? Mm-hmm. So they're pretty low in Massachusetts, and that's a good thing because children get the care and attention that they deserve. But it's not something that we necessarily want to change, but I think is a contributor to the cost, right? And then I'd just say lastly, it's expensive to live and work in Massachusetts, right? And again, because a majority of the system is not subsidized, child care centers have a lot of overhead. They've got rent, electricity, materials, staff, right? And in many cases, the cost of tuition is the only thing that they have to kind of cover those costs.
So if I'm looking at the differences in costs across the country, and let's say compare to California, where I know standards are pretty similar, is the difference that I'm seeing there primarily due to subsidies available in one place or another, or is there some other explanation that I may be missing? I mean, I recognize Massachusetts, high income, high cost of living state, but it just seems strange to me how much more expensive it is here compared to other high income states.
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, I think the federal government subsidizes a fraction of the cost, and many states have to put up their own funds
Yep.
To kind of supplement that. And Massachusetts does, right? Massachusetts maximizes the match on our federal dollars and goes kind of above and beyond that in many ways. But resources at the state level are finite in a way that they are not at the federal level. And so I think Massachusetts in recent years has made some really great investments in childcare, and hopefully that will come with serving more children over time. But I don't think Massachusetts is sort of unique in the problems and issues that we face in terms of high cost. I think it's all sort of relative.
Ashley, when we talk about proposals that are being looked at either nationwide or in Massachusetts specifically, can you outline any of them that are being discussed right now? I know we've talked a lot about the quality of care here in Massachusetts, but what is being done or what's being proposed to address the high cost? Because I'm sure I know several people where it's currently
Yep.
keeping them out of the labor force based on how high it costs to send a young infant to childcare.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think I'd just like to say that the child care has really been a priority for the House, for the Senate, for Beacon Hill over the past few years, and more recently, the new administration. That's been really, I think, great to see that child care is really listed as a top priority among those folks. And we've seen, as I said, increased investment in the budget, as well as an early ed bill that was introduced by the Ed Committee last session and ultimately passed by the Senate. I also want to highlight the C3 Stabilization Grant Program, which has been really essential to the field. These are monthly grants that go out to providers to cover a portion of their operational costs, to cover some of that high overhead that I talked about earlier. The program began during the pandemic with entirely federal dollars, but has been kept alive by supplementing it with state dollars. And the data has really shown that those grants have kept programs afloat. They've kept doors open, which is hopefully helps not dwindle supply further, which would increase costs even more. It's kept tuition costs down, and it's really allowed providers to increase their wages for their staff. And in fact, many providers have reported that these grants would if they were to stop, they would likely have to lower their expenses or raise additional revenue, through increased tuition. And so in January, the governor filed a supplemental budget, which was recently passed by the House and Senate, to fund that program through this fiscal year. And then her FY 2024 budget proposal fully funds this program for next year. And so I think really critical to kind of keep those grants alive because of what they've been able to do to sort of stabilize the child care costs in Massachusetts.
Ashley, we only have about a minute left here, but are you able to speak at all to the process and costs of owning and operating a daycare facility in Massachusetts? Because as you mentioned, you've seen a lot of closures over the last few years during the pandemic, and I'm wondering just how burdensome it is to operate one of these today.
Yeah, so I'm not a super expert on childcare licensing, but I think I can speak sort of generally as to what that process looks like. The Department of Early Education and Care oversees all licensing in Massachusetts. And so if you want to become a child care provider, you have to get licensed by the EEC. Generally speaking, you've got to be certified and take some essential trainings in terms of first aid and CPR and sleep practices, nutrition, all that kind of stuff. And then there's required trainings, as I said, and certifications and sort of mandatory inspections. But the process really varies depending on if you are a sort of family child care provider, which operates within their home, or you're a center-based provider, which typically operates in a commercial space. And there are sort of licensing fees, as you referenced, sort of the cost to become a provider that can be in the sort of hundreds of dollars. But again, depends on whether you're that family child care provider or that larger center-based.
That's Ashley White. She's a senior policy researcher at the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation, joining us today to talk about the very burdensome cost of child care in the state of Massachusetts. Ashley, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.